To those of you settling in with a cup of coffee or tea, seeking a story that warms rather than wounds, this one's for you. I've written this tale the way my grandmother used to tell stories on her porch in Colorado, slow enough to breathe, honest enough to matter. It's about a young woman named Eliza Harmon, who learned something most of us take a lifetime to understand, that the way others see us is not the truth of who we are. This is a story of healing, not the quick kind that comes from a bottle, but the slow kind that comes from being seen clearly by someone who doesn't look away. Set in the Colorado Territory of 1886, in a small town where gossip travels faster than the mail coach, and up a mountain where an old healer waits for those brave enough to climb. Pull up a chair. Let's begin. The woman stepped back. Eliza saw it happen, that small. Involuntary retreat. Mrs. Patterson's shoulders pulling away, her chin lifting as if she'd caught wind of something sour. The bolt of calico fabric sat between them on the counter. Blue flowers on white cotton. 7 cents a yard. Untouched. I'll wait for your aunt. Mrs. Patterson's eyes fixed somewhere above Eliza's head. Anywhere but her face. Anywhere but her hands. Of course. Ma'am? Eliza's voice came out steady. She'd had practice. The bell above the door chimed that familiar brass sound that had once meant customers, money, purpose. Now it just marked another retreat. Mrs. Patterson moved to examine a display of tinned peaches she'd shown no interest in moments before, her skirts swishing against the worn floorboards. Eliza stood behind the counter, her hands red, cracked, weeping at the knuckles resting on wood that 3 generations of merchants had polished smooth with their palms. The smell of the mercantile wrapped around her, pickle brine from the barrel by the door, tobacco from the glass case, molasses thick and sweet from somewhere in the back. A fly buzzed lazy circles around the sugar bin. 23 years old. This was her life now. From the stockroom doorway, Aunt Ida's voice cut through the morning quiet. Eliza, perhaps you'd better work in the back today. Not a question. Never a question anymore. Eliza gathered her skirts and moved past her aunt without meeting her eyes. The stockroom swallowed her dim, cramped, smelling of lamp oil and dust and the vinegar tang of pickles. Crates of merchandise formed walls around her, stacked higher than her head. Here, at least, no one stepped back. Here. The shadows didn't judge. She pressed her palms against a flour barrel, feeling the rough wood grain against her ruined skin. The rash had started 8 months ago, a small patch on her left wrist, no bigger than a penny. Dr. Brennan had called it impetigo, sold her a 50-cent salve in a brown glass bottle, and told her it would clear in a fortnight. It hadn't cleared. It had spread. First her hands, then her arms, creeping up like rust on a gate left out in the rain. Now, as of this morning, her face. She'd seen it in the small mirror above her washstand at dawn. Angry red patches climbing her cheeks, raw and weeping at the edges. Her reflection had stared back, and for a long moment, she hadn't recognized the woman looking at her. The face in the glass belonged to someone else, someone marked, someone ruined. You're still here, she'd thought, searching for something familiar in those tired eyes. Somewhere under all this, you're still here. But was she each day the patches spread? And each day the town's tolerance shrank. The children who used to wave at her on Main Street now hid behind their mothers' skirts. The farmers who'd once tipped their hats now found reasons to examine their boots when she passed. And Mrs. Patterson, who'd bought fabric from Eliza every month for 3 years, who'd pressed a dime into her palm just last spring and called her a good girl, couldn't bear to stand within arm's reach. Amazing how quickly good girls became burdens. Eliza moved through the stockroom, counting barrels without seeing them. Her hands trembled as she marked numbers in the ledger her aunt kept. The trembling wasn't from cold. They think it's catching, she told herself. They don't know any better. They're just afraid. But knowing why they fled didn't make the fleeing hurt less. She was deep in the back corner, behind the pickle crates where the light barely reached. When her hand brushed something in her apron pocket, paper, folded small and tight, Eliza frowned. She hadn't put anything there this morning. She remembered dressing in the gray dark before dawn, tying her apron strings with fingers still stiff from sleep. The pocket had been empty. She unfolded the paper carefully. Cheap brown stock wrapping paper from the counter, the kind they used for parcels. Someone had written on it in pencil. The letters rough but readable, Silas Thorne. Last cabin before the ridge. He fixed my husband when the doc gave up. Don't wait too long. No signature. No name. Eliza read it 3 times, the words blurring and sharpening as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Silas Thorne. She'd heard the name spoken in half whispers around the store, the mountain man who lived alone up past the old Garrett claim. Some said he was a hermit, touched in the head from the war. Others said he knew things about healing that regular doctors didn't. Things learned in places respectable folks didn't ask about. People talked about him the way they talked about thunderstorms, with respect and a healthy distance. He fixed my husband when the doc gave up. Someone had slipped this into her pocket. Someone had seen her, really seen her, not just the patches and the shame, and decided she was worth the risk of putting pencil to paper. The thought cracked something in her chest. Not broke, cracked. Like ice on a pond in early spring, when the water beneath starts remembering how to move. A door slammed in the front of the store. Voices drifted back Aunt Ida's careful pleasantry. A customer's clipped demands. The brass bell chiming as someone else came or went. Eliza stayed where she was, hidden among the crates, reading the note again and again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something she could understand. Don't wait too long. How long was too long? Until the patches covered her entirely. Until Dr. Brennan gave up on her too. The way he'd apparently given up on whoever's husband had needed Silas Thorne. Until Aunt Ida finally said what Eliza could see building in her eyes every morning, that keeping her here was bad for business. That charity had its limits. That perhaps the poorhouse in Denver would take her. She folded the note and tucked it back into her pocket, pressing her palm flat against her apron to feel the small square of paper against her hip. A secret. A possibility. A door that might or might not lead anywhere. Silas Thorne. The mountain. It was probably nothing. Probably foolishness. The kind of false hope desperate people clung to when real medicine failed. She'd heard stories of mountain healers who turned out to be charlatans, selling colored water and whispered prayers to folks too sick to know better. But someone had believed enough to write that note. Someone had looked at Eliza Harmon, the town's shame, the woman with the face that made children hide, and thought she was worth saving. That evening, after the store closed and the last customer had gone, Eliza climbed the narrow stairs to her room. The space was barely bigger than a closet, a cot pushed against the wall, a washstand with a chipped basin, a small trunk, holding everything she owned. The mirror above the washstand reflected the last of the daylight through the single window, and she forced herself to look. The patches had darkened since morning, red shading toward angry purple at the edges. Her cheeks looked like someone had pressed hot coals against them and held them there. Tomorrow, maybe the next day, her aunt would tell her she couldn't work the counter anymore, not even with gloves. Eliza opened the trunk and counted her savings, $14.30 in coins, wrapped in a handkerchief her mother had embroidered with small blue flowers. Tips from grateful customers over the years. Before the sickness came, back when people looked at her and saw a pleasant young woman, maybe plain, maybe heavy in the hips and soft in the chin, but useful, competent, worth a kind word and a few extra pennies for carrying packages to their wagons. She could remember Mrs. Patterson pressing a dime into her palm just last spring. "You're a good girl. Eliza, don't let anyone tell you different." Amazing how fast the world could change. She lifted her mother's Bible from the trunk leather cover worn soft as cloth from years of handling, a pressed columbine flower marking the 23rd Psalm. Her mother had died of typhoid when Eliza was 15. Her father 3 days later. Aunt Ida had taken her in not from love but from obligation. The sister's child, alone in the world. What choice did she have? What would people say if she'd turned the girl away? "The Lord is my shepherd," Eliza thought, running her finger over the flower's faded purple petals, her mother's handwriting in the margins, small and neat. Trust in his timing. She wanted to trust. She wanted to believe that somewhere in all of this, there was a purpose, a plan, a reason why her skin had turned against her and her world had shrunk to the size of a stockroom. But it was hard to trust when everyone you met stepped back. Silas Thorne, last cabin before the ridge. In the morning, Eliza woke before the first rooster crowed. She dressed in her oldest calico, the one with the faded roses that Aunt Ida said made her look like a parlor sofa, but was the sturdiest thing she owned. She packed her savings, her mother's Bible, and a clean chemise into a canvas bundle. She loosened her stays until she could breathe deep. It would be a long climb, and vanity had no place where she was going. She left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to find help. Back when I can." The North Trail began at the edge of town, winding up through lodgepole pines toward the high country. The air was cool in the pre-dawn gray, sweet with pine sap and the promise of rain somewhere beyond the peaks. Eliza walked until the town disappeared behind her, until the only sounds were her own labored breathing, the crunch of her boots on packed earth, and the complaints of jays waking in the branches overhead. Her body fought her every step. Her knees ached. Her lungs burned. The stays, even loosened, dug into ribs slick with sweat, and she could feel the rash beneath her chemise raw, weeping, angry at the friction of fabric against damaged skin. Twice she stopped to catch her breath. Hands braced on her thighs, sweat dripping from her chin. A voice whispered in her head. Her aunt's voice, sharp and certain. Too heavy, too weak, too much trouble. Turn back. It sounded like every customer who'd ever looked at her and seen only her size. It sounded like the children who giggled behind their hands, the men who looked through her, the women who pulled their skirts aside, as if her condition might leap from her body to theirs like a spark jumping to dry tinder. Eliza pushed off her knees and kept climbing. The voice didn't stop. Neither did she. By late afternoon, when the shadows grew long and her legs shook with every step, she smelled at first wood smoke and something green underneath, sharp, herbal, like the medicines her mother used to brew when Eliza was small and feverish, back when the world was safe and someone else did the worrying. Then she saw it through a gap in the pines, a cabin. Log walls chinked with mud, a stone chimney trailing gray, a split-rail fence surrounding a garden she couldn't quite make out from here, planted with things that weren't vegetables. 50 yards. She stopped at the tree line. Her hand rose without thinking, moving to cover the patches on her neck. The old gesture, the protective instinct she'd learned without learning, the way you learn to flinch from fire. Let them think it's not so bad. Let them not see. But she'd climbed a mountain to be seen. What was the point of hiding now? She forced her hand down, straightened her spine despite the ache, felt the sweat cooling on her back and the fear churning in her stomach like something alive. The cabin door was closed. No one moved behind the oiled paper windows. Maybe he wasn't home. Maybe he'd take one look at her and send her back down. Maybe this whole journey was the last foolish hope of a woman who'd run out of everywhere else to turn. There was only one way to find out. Eliza walked forward. The fence gate creaked when she touched it. The garden smelled of sage, and something sweeter she couldn't name. Her boots found the path worn smooth by years of footsteps, and she followed it to the porch, to the door, to the place where everything would change or nothing would. She raised her hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles touched wood, and Silas Thorne stood there, watching her with pale eyes that didn't look away. If this story brings back memories of someone who showed you kindness when you least expected it, I'd be honored if you'd share where you're reading from today. As the old folks used to say, a story shared is a blessing doubled. The trail steepened past the old Garrett claim, a collapsed mine shaft and rusted equipment slowly being swallowed by scrub oak and wild grass. Eliza paused there, one hand braced against a pine trunk, bark rough and sticky with sap under her palm. Her lungs heaved. Her calves burned like someone had poured hot coals inside them. 3 hours since town. The sun had climbed to mid-morning, and the air smelled of warm pine needles and the dry dust she kicked up with every step. Somewhere above, a hawk circled lazy and patient, riding the thermals. She'd brought no water. Stupid. The kind of mistake a town girl made when she'd never climbed higher than the church steps on Sunday morning. A creek appeared around the next bend, tumbling over mossy rocks with a sound like laughter. Eliza dropped to her knees on the bank, not caring about the mud soaking through her skirt. She cupped her hands, drank until her stomach cramped with cold. The water tasted of snowmelt and stone, so cold it made her teeth ache. She didn't look at her reflection in the pool below the rocks, didn't want to see what the morning's climb had done to her face. Keep moving. The voice in her head had changed. No longer Aunt Ida's sharp criticism. Now it sounded like her father, that quiet stubbornness he'd carried like a coat he never took off. The same tone he'd used when the typhoid took hold, when he'd insisted on sitting up with her mother through the night though the fever was already burning in his own blood. 1 foot, then the other. That's all walking is. Lizzie girl. Eliza pushed herself up from the creek bank. Her knees popped. Her right ankle, the one she'd turned on a route an hour back, throbbed with each step. A dull pulse that matched her heartbeat. She ignored it the way she'd learned to ignore the stairs in town. The pines thinned as the trail climbed higher. Aspens appeared among them, their pale bark peeling like old paper, their leaves shivering in a breeze she couldn't feel down at ground level. The air grew cooler, thinner. Each breath came harder than the last, and she could taste something sharp at the back of her throat, the altitude, maybe, or just her body begging her to stop. She stopped counting her steps after 500, stopped thinking about the cabin that might or might not help her, stopped thinking at all. Just the rhythm, left foot, right foot, the crunch of pine needles and loose stone, the whisper of her skirts against undergrowth, the rasp of her own breathing loud in her ears. Late afternoon light slanted gold through the trees when she smelled it. Smoke. Wood smoke. With something else underneath, something green and sharp that cut through the forest smell like a knife through soft butter. Herbs, maybe. Medicine. The smell her mother's kitchen used to have when someone in the family was sick. Eliza's heart stuttered against her ribs. Through a gap in the aspens, a cabin. Log walls dark with age. A stone chimney trailing gray smoke into the pale sky. A split-rail fence surrounding a garden planted with things she didn't recognize, silver-leafed plants and purple flowers. And stalks gone to seed. And on the porch, rising slow from a rocking chair, a figure watching her approach. He'd seen her coming. How long had he been sitting there, waiting? The man on the porch didn't move as Eliza crossed the last 50 yards. He stood with one hand resting on the porch rail, watching her the way a hawk watches movement in the grass, patient. Still, measuring. Eliza's legs trembled beneath her skirts. Her breath came in short gasps that she couldn't slow no matter how hard she tried. The rash on her face burned where the sweat had dried to salt. And she could feel the patches on her neck pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She stopped at the fence gate. The latch was iron. Cold under her fingers, despite the afternoon warmth. Up close. The cabin was solid, well-built. Well-maintained. The kind of construction that said someone had planned to stay. The garden behind the split rails held rows of plants she didn't recognize, green and silver and deep purple, some flowering, others gone to seed and waiting for harvest. The smell of herbs was stronger here, layered over wood smoke and the faint copper tang of something she couldn't name. The man was older than she'd expected, 60, maybe more, gray beard trimmed close to his jaw. Not wild like she'd imagined a hermit's would be, shoulders still broad beneath a flannel shirt washed so many times the red and black check had faded to rust and charcoal. His eyes were pale blue or gray. She couldn't tell from this distance, and they hadn't left her face since she'd emerged from the tree line. "You the Harmon girl." His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against gravel. Eliza's throat tightened. "How'd you know? Ain't many climb up here unless they're out of choices." He came down the porch steps, moving with the careful economy of a man whose joints had started to complain about the altitude and the years. "Let me see your hands." She held them out before she could think to refuse. The trembling was worse now, exhaustion and nerves tangling together until her fingers shook. Like aspen leaves in a storm. He took her right hand in both of his. His palms were rough, calloused, warm from sitting in the afternoon sun. He turned her hand over, studying the angry red patches that covered her knuckles and crept up past her wrists. His thumbs pressed gently against the swollen skin, testing the texture, the heat. She flinched. "Hurts. Some. More than some, I reckon." He released her hand and gestured toward the cabin door. "Inside. Need to see it proper. In good light." The interior was dim after the bright afternoon, and Eliza stood blinking in the doorway while her eyes adjusted. Clean plank floors, swept smooth. Walls lined with shelves holding jars and bundles, and books, more books than she'd expected, stacked and leaning against each other like tired soldiers. A potbelly stove in the corner. Cold now, but blackened from years of use. A table with 2 chairs. The smell of dried sage. and something sweeter underneath, like honey left too long in the sun. Sit. He pointed to a stool near the east-facing window where the light came through oiled paper in a soft yellow glow. I'll need to see the rest. Whatever you can show decent. Eliza sat. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons at her collar, 3 of them. Bone buttons her mother had sewn on years ago, each one smaller than the last. They slipped from her grip as her hands continued to shake. She got them open, pulled the fabric aside to expose her neck, her collarbone, the rash that had spread across her chest like a map of territory, lost. She waited for the intake of breath, the step backward, the small, involuntary retreat she'd learned to expect from everyone who saw what she'd become. It didn't come. Silas Thorne pulled up a chair across from her, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his shirt and the pine sap on his hands. He leaned forward, tilting her chin toward the window with 2 fingers. His touch was firm but not rough, businesslike. The way she imagined a surgeon might handle a wound that needed examining, not judging. When did it start? 8 months ago? Just a small patch on my wrist. What'd the doc say? Impetigo. Gave me a salve. A sound came from his throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a grunt, something dismissive. Brennan. Yes, sir. Brennan's a fool. He released her chin and sat back, his pale eyes moving over her face, her neck, her hands, cataloging what he saw the way a storekeeper catalogs inventory. This ain't impetigo, ain't catching, neither. It's eczema, gone bad from something you're touching or eating. Something's making it worse, and we need to find out what. Eliza stared at him. The words didn't fit together right in her head. 8 months of fear. 8 months of watching people recoil. 8 months of becoming the town's shame. The thing mothers pulled their children away from. The creature that made respectable women step back. And this man sat 2 feet away and told her it wasn't what she'd been told, wasn't what she'd believed, wasn't the slow corruption of her body that she'd come to accept as her fate. It can be fixed, treated, managed, different things. He stood, crossed to the shelves, pulled down a jar filled with something thick and yellow. You'll need to stay a week, maybe 2. There's a room in back. Ain't much, but it's clean. I can pay? She reached for her bundle. For the $14 that represented 3 years of tips and careful saving. We'll settle that later. He set the jar on the table between them. First thing's finding what's causing this. Means changing what you eat, what you wash with, watching close to see what makes it better or worse. Eliza looked at the jar, at the cabin walls lined with remedies she didn't understand. At this stranger who'd looked at her ruined skin without flinching, who'd touched her hands without pulling away, who spoke of her condition as a problem to be solved rather than a judgment passed down. Why? The word came out before she could stop it. Why would you help me? Silas Thorne was quiet for a long moment. He turned toward the window, and the afternoon light caught the lines on his face, deep grooves around his mouth, crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the weathered terrain of a man who'd spent decades under open sky and hard weather. Had a daughter once. His voice dropped, rougher than before. Sarah. Fever took her. Took my wife Mary the same week. Winter of 71. Eliza's chest tightened. She thought of her own parents, the typhoid that had swept through their house in 3 terrible days. I was a surgeon in the war, Antietam, 62. Saw men die of wounds that should have killed them in minutes, and others live through things that should have been fatal 10 times over. Thought I knew something about medicine. He turned back to face her, and something in his pale eyes had shifted, not softer exactly, but deeper, like looking into a well that went down farther than you expected. Couldn't save them. Sat there for 3 days watching the fever burn through them. And everything I knew wasn't enough. He picked up the jar of salve and held it out to her. Spent the next 15 years learning everything I should have known before. Every herb, every remedy, every treatment the regular docs don't teach because there's no money in it. His hand was steady. Too late for them, but maybe not for others. Eliza took the jar. It was warm from sitting on the shelf near the window, and the weight of it settled into her palm like an anchor finding bottom. This is calendula salve. You'll apply it twice a day, morning and night. I'll show you how. She unscrewed the lid. The salve inside was thick and golden, smelling of flowers and something earthier underneath beeswax, maybe, and rendered fat. She dipped one finger in, brought it to the worst patch on her left hand, and looked up at him for guidance. Gentle circles. He demonstrated in the air, his weathered finger tracing slow loops. No scrubbing. Let the skin drink it in. She spread the salve across her cracked knuckles, cool at first, then warming as it sank into her damaged skin. The angry throbbing quieted, not gone, but muffled, like a shout reduced to a whisper. Tomorrow we start figuring out what your skin's angry about. He moved toward the back of the cabin, toward a door she hadn't noticed in the shadows. For now, Mom, you rest. There's water in the pitcher, and I'll bring supper when it's ready. He opened the door to reveal a small room barely bigger than a closet, holding a narrow cot with a rope frame and a washstand with a chipped basin, a clean wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed. A small window covered with muslin let in the last of the daylight, soft and golden. Eliza stepped inside. The room smelled of cedar and dried lavender clean. Simple. Nothing like the musty stockroom where she'd spent so many hours hiding from customers who couldn't bear to look at her. Mr. Thorne, he paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. Thank you. He nodded once, a small movement that said more than words would have. Then he pulled the door closed behind him. Eliza sat on the edge of the cot. The rope frame creaked beneath her weight. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving around the cabin, the scrape of a pot on the stove, the creak of floorboards, the small sounds of a life built in solitude. She looked down at the jar still clutched in her hands. Calendula salve. Something to apply twice a day. A treatment? Not a cure, he'd been clear about that. But treatment meant hope. Treatment meant someone believed her body could heal. She finished applying the salve to both hands, then carefully worked it into the patches on her neck, on her collarbone. Everywhere she could reach, her own hands on her own body, caring for herself instead of hiding. When had she last touched herself with anything other than shame? The salve cooled as it settled into her skin. Eliza lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling where the log beams showed the marks of the axe that had shaped them. The mountain silence wrapped around her. No whispers, no retreating footsteps, no children's mocking laughter. Just the creak of the cabin settling into evening, the distant call of a bird she couldn't name, and the soft pop of wood in the stove. Tomorrow the real work would start. Tomorrow she'd learn what her skin was angry about, what foods to avoid, what had been poisoning her from the inside out without her knowing. But tonight, in this room no bigger than a closet, on a mountain so far from town that no one could see her shame, Eliza Harmon allowed herself to do something she hadn't done in 8 months. She closed her eyes. She breathed deep. And she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Sleep was pulling her down when she heard it. Through the wall, Silas's voice. Low, murmuring, steady like a prayer. But the words weren't scripture. They were names, and questions, and long pauses, as if he was waiting for answers that never came. He lived alone. She'd seen no one else. No other boots by the door. No second plate on the table. Who was he talking to in the dark? Eliza woke to light filtering through muslin and the smell of something cooking. Oats. Stewed fruit apples. Maybe. Soft and sweet. Her stomach clenched hard. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast. A heel of bread grabbed on her way out of Aunt Ida's kitchen in the gray dark before dawn. She lay still for a moment, letting her body remember where she was. The narrow cot with its rope frame. The cedar-scented walls. The wool blanket rough against her chin. The mountain cabin where a stranger had looked at her skin and not stepped back. The murmuring she'd heard through the wall last night, she remembered it now. That low voice rising and falling in the darkness. But the cabin was quiet this morning. Just the pop and crackle of a fire in the stove and the soft scrape of a spoon against a pot. She sat up slowly. Her body ached in places she'd forgotten existed, her calves tight as fiddle strings, her lower back stiff, the muscles along her ribs sore where she'd pushed against her loosened stays for hours on that climb. The rash on her neck itched, but differently than before, less angry. The salve had dried to a thin film overnight. And when she touched the patches on her collarbone, the skin felt smoother than it had in months. The jar sat on the washstand where she'd left it, catching the early light through the muslin curtain. She reached for it, unscrewed the lid, and applied more salve to her hands the way Silas had shown her. Gentle circles. No scrubbing. Let the skin drink it in. A knock on the door frame. 2 quick raps. Breakfast ready. Come out when you're decent. Eliza buttoned her collar, smoothed her hair as best she could with her fingers. No mirror in this room. She noticed. Nothing to show her what she looked like, and pushed open the door. Silas stood at the stove, ladling oats from a blackened pot into 2 tin bowls. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the smell of breakfast across the small cabin. A smaller pot sat on the table, lid off, holding stewed apples gone soft and golden. A pitcher of water and 2 cups waited beside it. Morning light came through the east-facing window, turning the oiled paper warm and yellow. Dust motes drifted in the air like tiny stars. Sit? He set a bowl in front of the chair nearest the window. Eat slow. Your stomach ain't used to climbing. Eliza sat. The chair creaked beneath her old wood, worn smooth by years of use. She picked up the spoon he'd laid beside the bowl. Tin like the bowl. Practical? Nothing fancy? The oats were thick, unsweetened, cooked with a pinch of salt that brought out the grain's natural flavor. The apples were soft, their skins splitting, sweetened only by their own juice. Nothing like the breakfast Aunt Ida made: biscuits and gravy heavy with flour, eggs fried in bacon fat, strong coffee with cream from the Henderson's dairy. No wheat, Silas said, settling into the chair across from her. His own bowl steamed in front of him, untouched while he watched her take her first bite. No milk, no cream, no butter, Your skin's angry at something, and those are the common troubles. We cut them out. See what happens. Eliza took another bite of the oats. Plain, filling. The warmth spread through her chest and down into her empty stomach. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she started eating the kind of hunger that goes beyond the body, the hunger of someone who hasn't been cared for in longer than she can remember. How long did 2 weeks, maybe 3? We watch close. If the rash gets better, we start adding things back in, one at a time, find out which one's the troublemaker. He picked up his spoon, finally, and took a bite of his own breakfast. Your body'll tell us what it needs. We just gotta learn to listen. She ate in silence, watching him over the rim of her bowl. He ate the same food she did, no special treatment for himself, no hidden luxuries tucked away in the cupboard. His movements were economical, precise, a man who'd learned not to waste anything, not food, not motion, not words. The salve, she said, scraping the last of the oats from the bottom of the bowl. What's in it? Calendula flowers, steeped in oil for 6 weeks, beeswax to hold it together, tallow rendered clean from beef fat. He set down his spoon, pushed his empty bowl aside. The calendula's for healing pulls the heat out, helps the skin close up, beeswax seals it in, keeps the moisture where it belongs. Tallow carries it deep, down past the surface where the real damage is. Where'd you learn all this? He was quiet for a moment, reached for the water pitcher, poured himself a cup, drank deep before answering. War taught me what the body can survive. Everything else I learned after. His pale eyes met hers across the table, steady and measuring. Had a lot of years to learn, and a lot of reasons to keep learning. Eliza thought of the murmuring she'd heard through the wall last night, the names, the questions, the long silences. She wanted to ask, but something in his face told her not to. Not yet. Some doors weren't meant to be opened until the person on the other side was ready. What do I do today? First, you bathe. He stood, crossed to a corner of the cabin where a copper tub sat beneath a canvas cover. The tub was hip deep, big enough for a grown person to sit in with their knees bent. Water's been heating on the stove since before dawn. I'll add oatmeal ground fine, so fine it dissolves like flour in water, soothes the skin, pulls out the heat and the itch. She watched him prepare the bath with the same careful attention he'd given to breakfast. Bucket after bucket of water from the reservoir on the stove, steam rising as he poured. A handful of oatmeal ground so fine it was almost powder, stirred in until the water turned cloudy and soft. A clean cloth laid over the rim for her to dry with. I'll be in the garden, he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. Take your time. Don't scrub, just soak. Let the water do the work. Call out when you're done. The door closed behind him. Eliza stood alone in the cabin, steam rising from the copper tub, the morning light slanting golden through the oiled paper windows. She undressed slowly, peeling away layers of sweat-stiffened fabric her calico dress, her chemise, her loosened stays. She kept her eyes forward, not looking down at the body she'd learned to despise. The water was warm, not hot. Silas had been careful about that, testing the temperature with his elbow, the way a mother tests bathwater for a baby. She lowered herself in, her knees bending to fit, and felt the oatmeal-clouded water rise around her like an embrace. The itching stopped. Not faded, not quieted. Stopped. For the first time in 8 months, the constant fire beneath her skin banked to nothing. The burning that had woken her every night, that had driven her to scratch until she bled, that had made her want to tear her own skin off just to make it stop, gone, silenced, as if someone had finally closed a door that had been banging open in a storm. She leaned her head back against the rim of the tub and closed her eyes. The silence pressed in around her, not the hostile silence of the stockroom where she'd hidden from customers, not the heavy silence of her aunt's kitchen thick with things unsaid. Something softer. A silence that asked nothing of her. Her hands floated in the milky water. She could see the patches on her arms, still red, still raised, but not screaming the way they had yesterday. The salve and the bath were doing something real. Her throat closed tight. She pressed her palm over her mouth, but it didn't help. The tears came anyway, sliding down her cheeks, dropping into the bathwater, mixing with the oatmeal and the warmth. She didn't try to stop them. No one could see. No one would step back from her crying the way they stepped back from her skin. She stayed in the tub until the water cooled and her fingers pruned like raisins. Then she rose, dried herself with the clean cloth, and dressed in the fresh chemise she'd packed. Her old clothes needed washing. She'd ask Silas about the soap, make sure it was something that wouldn't set off her skin again. When she opened the cabin door, he was kneeling in the garden, hands deep in the soil around a plant with silvery leaves. He looked up at her approach, shading his eyes against the morning sun. Better, yes. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The itching stopped. He nodded, brushed dirt from his palms, and stood. His knees popped as he straightened the sound of a body that had worked hard for a lot of years. That's the oatmeal. Calms the inflammation, gives the skin a chance to rest. You'll bathe like that every day, morning and evening both. Every day, morning and evening. A regimen, a routine, something to do besides hide. I want to help, she said. I can't just sit here and be fixed like a chair with a broken leg. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close, a crack in the stone of his face. Can you cook without wheat flour? I can learn. Then tonight you'll make supper. He gestured toward the cabin. There's venison in the cold box out back, potatoes in the root cellar. No flour for thickening, use potato instead. Mash it fine, stir it into the broth. Eliza felt something shift in her chest. Not hope she'd felt that last night. Fragile and uncertain. This was different. Smaller and more solid. Like a seed finding purchase in rocky soil. Purpose. She had a task. A way to contribute. Something besides her damaged skin to offer this man who'd taken her in. Mr. Thorne? He'd turned back toward the garden, reaching for a trowel half buried in the dark soil. The salve, the calendula. Can you teach me to make it? His hand stopped above the trowel. He straightened slowly, turned to look at her with those pale, measuring eyes. You want to learn? I want to understand what's happening to me, what's helping, why. She met his gaze without looking away, though part of her wanted to drop her eyes the way she'd learned to do in town. I've spent 8 months not knowing, not understanding. Folks telling me one thing, my body telling me another. I'm tired of feeling like a stranger in my own skin. The silence stretched between them. In the garden, a bee droned past, heavy with pollen from the purple-flowered plants along the fence. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of her neck where the rash had already started to fade. Tomorrow, Silas said finally. I'll show you the calendula first, how to harvest it, how to dry it proper, how to steep it in oil so it pulls out the healing. Takes patience. Takes time. You got to learn to wait for things to be ready instead of rushing them. I can wait. She'd been waiting her whole life. It seemed waiting to be seen, waiting to be valued, waiting for someone to look at her and not step back. For now, go rest. Let the bath do its work. This afternoon I'll show you the root cellar. Teach you what's what. Eliza returned to the cabin. Her small room waited, the cot neatly made, the jar of salve on the washstand catching the morning light. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands still marked, still damaged, but somehow less foreign than they'd been yesterday, less shameful, less like something to hide. Through the window, she watched Silas working in the garden, his back bent over the silver-leafed plants. He moved with the patience of a man who understood that growth took time, that healing couldn't be rushed, that some things had to be tended slowly, day after day, before they'd show you what they could become. She thought about what he'd said last night. Had a daughter once. Fever took her, and the murmuring she'd heard through the wall, his voice low and steady, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. He talked to them. She was almost certain now. Talked to his wife and daughter in the dark, the way some folks talk to the Lord, keeping them close the only way he could. What did he say to them? What did he tell the ghosts of the women he'd loved and lost? And did they ever answer back? A week passed on the mountain. Eliza learned the rhythm of Silas Thorne's days the way she'd once learned the rhythm of the mercantile, by watching, by listening, by fitting herself into the spaces where she could be useful. Up before dawn to check the garden for pests and frost damage, breakfast of oats and fruit, eaten in the quiet of early morning while the wood stove ticked and settled. Morning bath in oatmeal water, the copper tub steaming in the cool cabin air. Afternoon spent harvesting herbs, hanging them to dry from the rafters, grinding dried leaves and flowers into powders and pastes. Evenings by the stove with books she'd never heard of, medical texts with Latin names and drawings of plants that looked like something from a fever dream. The patches on her arms faded from angry red to dull pink. The weeping stopped. The itching quieted to a whisper she could almost ignore, a faint murmur beneath her skin instead of a scream. And she cooked. That first venison stew had been a trial. The potato mash too coarse, leaving lumps that floated in the broth like small islands. The meat cut too thick, chewy instead of tender. The whole thing more paste than supper, thick enough to stand a spoon in. Silas had eaten 2 bowls without a word. Not a complaint, not a compliment. Just steady spoonfuls until the bowl was empty, then a second helping, then a nod in her direction before he rose to wash up. That silence told her what she needed to know. She'd done well enough. Well enough was a start. By the 3rd night, she'd learned to render the fat properly slow heat, patient stirring, skimming the foam until what remained was clear as water. By the 5th, she could time the potatoes so they dissolved into the broth without lumping, thickening the stew to a consistency that coated the back of the spoon. By the 7th, Silas set down his empty bowl, pushed back from the table, and spoke. Better than what I make. 4 words. More praise than Aunt Ida had given her in 3 years of working without wages in that mercantile. The morning after, Eliza stood in front of his herb shelves and felt her fingers itch to organize. The jars were chaos. Calendula next to comfrey, next to something labeled with a pencil mark so smudged she couldn't read it. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters in no particular order, yarrow tangled with sage, lavender mixed in with something that smelled sharp and medicinal. A man's system, which meant no system at all. Just things put wherever there was space. Mind if I straighten these? Silas looked up from the book he was reading, something about wound care. The pages yellowed with age, the spine cracked from use. His pale eyes moved from her face to the shelves and back again. "Do what you want." She started with the jars. Took each one down from the shelf, checked the contents against the faded labels, wrote new labels on strips of brown paper in her careful hand. Calendula for skin healing, comfrey for bones and sprains, yarrow for bleeding and fever, willow bark for pain. She grouped them by use, healing herbs on the top shelf where the light was best, pain relief on the second, digestive remedies on the third, and things she didn't recognize yet on the bottom where she could study them later. The work took 2 days. Her hands cramped from writing. Her shoulders ached from reaching up to the highest shelves. Her neck grew stiff from tilting her head back to read the faded labels on jars pushed to the back corners. But when she finished, the shelves looked like something from a real apothecary. Orderly, readable, a system that made sense to anyone who walked in, not just the man who'd put things away in the first place. Silas came in from gathering willow bark on the second afternoon. His boots were muddy, his hands rough with sap and dirt, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder bulging with pale bark strips. He stopped just inside the doorway. His eyes moved across the reorganized shelves, the neat rows of jars, each one labeled in Eliza's clear handwriting. The bundles of dried herbs sorted by type and hung in clusters along the rafters, the bottom shelf cleared of clutter. Ready for the new specimens he'd brought in? He crossed to the shelves. His finger traced the edge of a jar. Calendula. The label read, "Skin healing, burns, rashes." "Well," he said. That was all. One word, hanging in the air between them like smoke from a blown-out candle. But he didn't undo her work. Didn't rearrange the jars back into chaos. Just stood there, looking at what she'd done. His weathered face unreadable. That evening, supper was rabbit. A pair Silas had snared that morning. Dressed and cleaned and hanging in the cold box behind the cabin. Eliza had prepared them herself, her hands steady on the knife. The work familiar from helping Aunt Ida prepare chickens for Sunday dinner back when she was still allowed in the kitchen. The meat fell off the bones in the stew, tender and rich, flavored with wild onions from the garden and herbs she'd learned to recognize from her work on the shelves. The broth was thick without being heavy, seasoned with salt and a pinch of something peppery Silas had shown her how to grind. They ate in the silence that had grown comfortable between them, not the hostile quiet of the mercantile stockroom where she'd hidden from customers, not the heavy absence of words that filled Aunt Ida's kitchen, thick with resentment and obligation. Something easier. The silence of two people who didn't need to fill the air with talk just to prove they were there. Silas finished his second bowl, pushed it aside with the back of his hand, poured himself water from the pitcher and drank deep before speaking. "You got a knack." His voice was quiet, rough as always, but without the edge. For systems, for seeing how things fit together when other folks just see mess. Eliza set down her spoon. "Had to learn. Aunt Ida's stockroom was pure chaos when I started working there. She couldn't find anything. Spent half her time hunting for inventory she knew she had somewhere. I figured out where things ought to go, made sense of it. That's a skill. Don't let anyone tell you different." The words settled into her chest like warmth from the stove. A skill. Not a burden, not something she did because she had to, because no one else would. Because she owed her aunt for the roof over her head, something she could do that had value, something worth noticing. The fire crackled in the potbelly stove, outside the oiled paper windows. The last light faded from the sky, and the first stars appeared faint pricks of silver in the darkening blue. "Had a daughter once," Eliza's hands went still on the table. Silas stared into the fire, his profile sharp in the orange light. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, carved by more than weather and years. Sarah, born in '66, year after the war ended, right after I came west to get away from everything I'd seen. His voice dropped lower, rougher. Her mother was Mary. We met in Denver. She'd had a hard road, but she was strong. Strongest woman I ever knew. We married inside a month. He fell silent. The fire popped and crackled. A log shifted in the stove, sending up a shower of sparks that glowed orange through the grate. Scarlet fever took them both. Winter of '71. Sarah was 5 years old. Mary was 28. His hand tightened on his cup, knuckles going white. I sat with them for 3 days, watched the fever burn through them like fire through dry kindling. Everything I'd learned in the war, every wound I'd stitched and every limb I'd saved, none of it was enough. Couldn't do a blessed thing but watch them go. Eliza didn't move, didn't speak. The words came from him like water rising from a deep well, slow and cold, pulled up from somewhere that rarely saw light. Spent the next 15 years learning everything I should have known before. Every herb, every remedy, every treatment the regular doctors don't teach because it don't come from their books. He drained his cup, set it down on the table harder than necessary. Too late for Mary, too late for Sarah, but maybe not too late for everyone. I'm sorry. The words felt thin, useless, like trying to patch a gaping wound with a handkerchief. Long time ago, but his voice said different. His voice said the wound was still raw, still bleeding in the dark places where no one could see. They sat without speaking while the fire burned down. Eliza gathered the bowls, washed them in the basin, dried them with a cloth worn soft from years of use. The familiar work steadied her hands, gave her something to focus on besides the weight of what he'd shared. Silas remained at the table, staring at something she couldn't see. His ghosts, maybe. The wife and daughter who'd been gone 15 years, but still lived in this cabin. In the murmured conversation she heard through the wall every night. The talking. She spoke quietly, not wanting to startle him. At night, through the wall, I've heard you. He looked up. His pale eyes met hers. And in them, she recognized something, the particular loneliness of a person who'd lost the only ones who mattered and had never figured out how to stop missing them. I talked to them, Mary and Sarah. Tell them about my day. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The only sign that this admission cost him anything. No, they can't hear. No, it's foolishness. But it helps me remember they were real. That they were here once. And I loved them, and they loved me back. Eliza set the last bowl on the shelf, dried her hands slowly on the worn cloth. It's not foolish, she said. It's how we keep them with us. The ones we've lost. She thought of her mother's Bible, the pressed flower marking the 23rd Psalm, the nights she'd held that book against her chest and whispered her mother's name into the darkness, hoping somehow the words would reach wherever she'd gone. My mother used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep, she heard herself say. After she died, I used to sing those songs to myself. Same ones, trying to hear her voice in my own. Silas was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. An owl called from somewhere in the pines outside. A low, mournful sound that seemed to fit the moment. Then he nodded. A single dip of his chin that acknowledged what she'd said without making a fuss over it. Get some sleep. Tomorrow I'm teaching you about yarrow. Useful for more than just bleeding, helps with fever too, if you know how to prepare it. Eliza returned to her small room. The cot waited in the darkness, wool blanket folded at the foot, the jar of salve a pale shape on the washstand. She undressed by feel, applied the salve to her hands, her neck, the fading patches on her chest. Through the wall, Silas's voice began its nightly murmur. Talking to Mary, to Sarah, to the family the fever had stolen and the years had failed to give back. She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of a man keeping his ghosts alive. In the morning, she would learn about yarrow. She would cook another meal. She would continue the slow work of healing her skin, yes. But something else too. Something deeper that she hadn't known was broken until she'd started to feel it mend. She fell asleep to the rhythm of his voice, low and steady through the thin cabin wall. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't dream of people stepping back. She dreamed of gardens instead, of silver-leafed plants and purple flowers, of jars arranged in neat rows on wooden shelves, of hands that knew how to heal because they'd learned what it cost to fail. The next morning brought clouds rolling in from the west, heavy and gray as wet wool, piling up against the peaks. Silas stood at the window through breakfast, his jaw tight, his oatmeal growing cold in the bowl. "Storm coming," he said finally. "Big one. From the look of it, need to get ready." They worked through the morning without rest, hauling extra water from the spring and filling every container in the cabin, securing the garden against wind with stakes and twine, counting the stores in the root cellar potatoes, carrots, jars of preserved vegetables Silas had put up last autumn. Enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3, if they stretched it careful. Eliza was in the root cellar counting onions when she heard the hoofbeats. Distant at first, muffled by the earthen walls and the thickening clouds above. Then closer, closer still, then stopping altogether, somewhere near the cabin. She climbed the ladder into gray afternoon light. A horse stood at the fence, lathered and breathing hard, its sides heaving. And on the porch, talking to Silas in a voice tight with pain, stood a man she recognized from town, Tom Garrett, the man whose family had abandoned the claim she'd passed on her way up the mountain a week ago. His right hand was wrapped in bloody cloth, and his face had gone the color of old ash. He saw her standing by the root cellar. His eyes went wide. What in blazes is she doing here? Silas appeared from behind the cabin, a coil of rope in one hand. His eyes moved from Tom Garrett's bloody wrapping to Eliza standing frozen by the root cellar entrance. "Trap got him," Silas said. Not a question. Tom's face was gray beneath his sunburn, the skin around his eyes tight with pain. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air rolling in with those heavy clouds. "Beaver trap. Checking the line this morning up past Miller's Creek. Didn't see the thing under the leaves." Inside, Silas dropped the rope on the porch. "Eliza, get the carbolic from the second shelf, the sharp-smelling stuff in the brown bottle with the cork stopper. Surgeons use it for cleaning wounds." She moved before she could think about it. Through the cabin door, past the cold stove, to the shelves she'd organized herself just yesterday. Brown bottle, second shelf, right where she'd put it. Carbolic acid. The label read in her own handwriting. She grabbed it and turned. Tom Garrett sat at the table, his injured hand stretched out before him on the worn wood. The bloody cloth had soaked through, dark red spreading through the fabric, and drops fell onto the plank floor in a slow, steady rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. He watched her approach with narrowed eyes. Ain't she got that thing, that skin disease that spreads? She's got eczema. Silas took the bottle from Eliza's hands, his fingers brushing hers. Steady, calm. Ain't catching, ain't contagious. Ain't even close to what that fool Brennan told her it was. He unstoppered the carbolic, and the sharp chemical smell filled the cabin, clean and harsh, cutting through the copper tang of blood. Now hold still and bite down on something. This is going to burn like the devil himself. He unwrapped the bloody cloth. Eliza saw the wound underneath and her stomach lurched, but she didn't look away. 2 fingers torn deep, the flesh ragged and raw where the trap's iron teeth had bitten through muscle. White bone showed beneath the blood, slick and wet in the gray afternoon light coming through the windows. Tom made a sound low in his throat as Silas poured carbolic over the wound. The liquid ran pink, washing away dirt and debris and whatever else had gotten into the torn flesh during his ride up the mountain. The smell of blood mixed with the sharp chemical bite until Eliza's eyes watered. "Eliza?" Silas's voice cut through the haze. Curved needle from the case on the top shelf. Catgut thread the spool next to the needles. She found them in the surgeon's kit she'd cataloged but never opened. The needle was small, wickedly sharp, curved like a fish hook. The thread was finer than she'd expected, almost translucent, wound tight on a wooden spool. She brought them to the table. Tom's eyes followed her every move, tracking her the way a hurt animal tracks anything that gets too close. "Hold the lamp," Silas said. "Need better light than what's coming through them windows." Eliza lifted the kerosene lamp from its hook by the door and positioned it over Tom's ruined hand. The flame flickered inside the glass chimney, casting sharp shadows across the wound. She held her arm steady, watching Silas thread the needle with hands that didn't shake even slightly. "You've done this before," she said. "War." The needle pierced skin. Tom groaned through clenched teeth, his good hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. "Antietam. Saw worse than this before breakfast most days. Boys with their legs blown off, bellies opened up, faces half gone from canister shot." Another stitch, placed with careful precision. "Learn to sew flesh the way farm wives sew quilts. Small stitches, even tension. Don't pull too tight or the skin tears worse." Eliza held the lamp steady. Her shoulder began to burn after the first 5 stitches. Her arm trembled after 10. She locked her elbow, braced her feet against the floor, and didn't lower the light. Tom watched her between flinches, between the gasps of pain as the curved needle pulled through his torn flesh again and again. Looking at her hands where they gripped the lamp, looking at her face where the patches had faded to pink shadows, looking at the woman who'd been the town's shame just a week ago and was now standing steady while he bled. 12 stitches. Silas tied off the last one with a knot so small Eliza could barely see it, then reached for clean cloth to wrap the hand. "Keep it dry," he said, winding the bandage around Tom's palm and between his fingers. "Change this everyday morning's best. When the wound's had all night to rest, I'll send calendula salve down with you when the weather clears. Apply it thin around the edges, not on the stitches themselves." Tom flexed his fingers carefully, testing the range of motion. The color was coming back to his face now, though his forehead still gleamed with sweat and his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Much obliged." The words came out stiff, reluctant, like they cost him something to say. But he said them while looking at Eliza, and that was something. That was more than she'd gotten from anyone in town for months. "Storm's coming in fast," Silas said, crossing to the window. The sky had darkened while they worked, the clouds piling up against the peaks like waves against a break wall. "You try to ride down now, you'll get caught in it halfway. Trail turns to mud in weather like this horse could break a leg." "And then where'd you be?" Tom's eyes flickered to Eliza. She saw the calculation there. The weighing of risks. Staying overnight in a cabin with the woman everyone in town called diseased. The woman mothers pulled their children away from. The creature that made respectable folks step back. "I'll sleep in the shed," Tom said finally. "Ain't got a shed fit for sleeping. Just a tool lean-to. And it ain't weathered proper." Silas turned from the window, his face unreadable. "There's a back room. Small, but it's got a cot and a roof that don't leak. Your choice, take it or ride down in the storm. Makes no difference to me. But I ain't explaining to your wife how you broke your fool neck on a muddy trail." Thunder rolled across the peaks, low and long, like something heavy being dragged across the sky. Tom looked at Eliza. Looked at the lamp still held steady in her hands, the light that had let Silas save his fingers. Looked at her face, her arms, the skin that wasn't weeping anymore, wasn't angry, wasn't anything like what he'd expected. "Fine," he said, "just for the night." The storm hit at dusk. Eliza had seen mountain storms before, watched from the mercantile's back room, while lightning split the sky and thunder rattled the windows. Safe behind glass and wooden walls, counting the seconds between flash and boom, the way her mother had taught her. This was different. The wind didn't just blow. It screamed, howling around the cabin like something alive and furious, clawing at the log walls, rattling the door in its frame. Rain came not in drops, but in sheets, hammering the roof, hard enough to hear over the wind, hard enough that she could feel the vibration through the floor beneath her feet. She sat on her pallet near the stove Tom had taken her room, her cot, and she'd made up a bed by the fire without complaint. The warmth was better here anyway. She could watch the flames through the grate, orange and gold, steady despite the chaos outside. Silas sat in his chair across from her, a book open on his lap that he wasn't reading. His pale eyes watched the fire, and the shadows played across his weathered face. "He looked at me different," Eliza said quietly, almost lost beneath the wind. "Tom, at the end, when you were wrapping his hand, he looked at me different than before. You helped save his fingers, helped save—" Silas turned a page he hadn't read. "Hard to think poorly of someone who held the light while a surgeon stitched you back together? He still thinks I'm catching. You could see it in his face when he first recognized me. He thinks what he was taught. What folks in town have been saying since your skin went bad." Another page turned, unread. "Takes time to unlearn what you've been told your whole life. But you gave him something to think about tonight. Something that don't fit with what he thought he knew." The wind screamed. Rain hammered. Somewhere in the darkness outside, a branch cracked and fell with a crash that made them both flinch, made Eliza's hand fly to her throat before she caught herself. "Get some rest," Silas said after the echoes faded. "Storm'll blow itself out by morning. Most like. Tom'll need to head down soon as the trail's passable, and I'll want you to help with checking his bandage before he goes." Eliza lay on her pallet, the wool blanket pulled up to her chin, the fire's warmth on one side and the storm's cold draft on the other. Through the wall, she could hear Tom Garrett's breathing uneven, restless, the rhythm of a man in pain trying to sleep in a strange bed. He'd looked at her differently. Not with kindness. Exactly. Not with acceptance. But without that immediate recoil, that involuntary step back that she'd learned to expect from everyone in town. He'd seen her hands gripping the lamp, steady for 20 minutes while his blood dripped onto the floor. He'd seen her standing close enough to touch while Silas worked. And something in him had shifted. It wasn't much. A crack in the wall, not a doorway. But cracks could widen. Walls could fall. The storm quieted sometime in the deep hours of night. Eliza dozed, woke to silence, dozed again. Each time her eyes opened. The wind was softer, the rain lighter, the fire burned lower in the grate, lower. She woke fully to gray dawn light leaking through the oiled paper windows. The cabin was cold. The fire had died to embers. Just a faint orange glow behind the stove's iron grate. And Silas's chair sat empty. His book closed on the seat where he'd left it. Eliza pushed off her blanket and crossed to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain washed clean trees dripping, ground churned to mud, the garden flattened but not destroyed. Silas stood at the edge of the property, near the fence gate, looking down the trail that led toward town. She pulled on her shoes, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and opened the cabin door. The air smelled of pine and wet earth and something sharper underneath ozone. Maybe. Left over from last night's lightning. "What is it?" Silas didn't turn. His shoulders were stiff beneath his worn flannel shirt. "Rider coming up," he said. "Moving fast for muddy trail." Eliza squinted down the trail. Saw nothing at first, just trees and mud and the gray morning light filtering through clouds that were already breaking apart. Then movement. A horse picking its way up the steep switchbacks, slipping in the muck. A figure in the saddle. Hunched forward. "Who can't tell yet?" His voice was flat, careful. "But ain't no one comes up this mountain that fast after a storm unless something's wrong or someone's angry." The rider broke through the tree line into the clearing below the cabin. Eliza recognized the horse first, a bay mare with a white blaze on her forehead. The one that pulled the delivery wagon for the mercantile. She'd helped harness that mare 100 times. Her throat closed up. The rider was Aunt Ida, and even from 50 yards away, Eliza could see her face. Aunt Ida dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, her boots sinking deep into the churned mud. Her riding skirt was splattered brown halfway to the knee, and her hair always pinned so carefully, so properly. Every strand in its place had come loose in wet strings around her face. She looked at Eliza the way she might look at a stain on good linen, something to be scrubbed out, something that shouldn't exist. "So this is where you've been hiding?" Eliza's hands tightened on the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The wool scratched against the healing patches on her arms, patches that had faded so much this past week, patches that were finally starting to look like normal skin again. "I left a note. A note." Aunt Ida's laugh was short, sharp as a slap. "Gone to find help. That's what you wrote. 3 words. Do you have any idea what people in town are saying, what they've been saying all week while you've been up here playing house? Ida?" Silas stepped forward, positioning himself between the two women. His voice was quiet, but something in it made Aunt Ida take a half step back, her boots squelching in the mud. "Maybe we should talk inside. You've had a hard ride." "I don't need rest. I don't need tea and sympathy from a mountain hermit." Aunt Ida's eyes swept across the cabin, the garden, the shed with its weathered boards. I need my niece to come home and face what she's done, what she's put me through. I came here to get treatment. Eliza's voice came out steadier than she expected. For my skin. The same skin that made you hide me in the stockroom like I was something shameful. Treatment. The word dripped contempt. Is that what they're calling it now? A young woman, unmarried, living under a man's roof for a week alone with him up here where no one can see? Aunt Ida stepped closer, her boots sinking deeper into the mud with each step. Do you know what that looks like to decent people? The words hit Eliza like a fist to the stomach. She felt the blood rise to her cheeks, her healthy cheeks, her healing cheeks, the cheeks that had finally stopped looking like raw meat. I came here because I was sick, because no one else would help me. And now you're ruined. Aunt Ida's voice rose, cutting through the quiet morning air. Whether anything improper happened or not, and I'm not fool enough to think I'll ever know the truth, it doesn't matter. The whole town has been talking. The church ladies have been organizing. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, they're all saying the same thing. The Harmon girl ran off to live with the mountain man. The Harmon girl has forgotten her place. Tom Garrett appeared in the cabin doorway, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest. His face was pale from a restless night, his eyes shadowed. But they sharpened as he took in the scene, Aunt Ida red-faced and mud-spattered, Eliza wrapped in a shawl with her chin lifted, Silas standing between them like a wall. Mrs. Harmon? Tom's voice was careful, measured. Didn't expect to see you up here. Aunt Ida's face changed. The fury shifted to something more calculated, a merchant's smile, thin and practiced, the same smile she used on customers who were slow to pay their accounts. Mr. Garrett, I didn't realize you were visiting. Trap got my hand yesterday. Caught it bad, would have lost my fingers if I hadn't come up here for help. Tom lifted his bandaged hand so she could see the wrapping, the neat work Silas had done. Mr. Thorne stitched me back together. Your niece assisted held the lamp for near half an hour while he worked. Didn't flinch once. The silence stretched tight as a fiddle string. Eliza watched her aunt's expression flicker surprise, then reassessment, then something harder settling back into place. A jaw tightening. A decision made. How generous of her. Aunt Ida turned back to Eliza. But generous or not, you're coming home. Today. Now. I won't have people talking any more than they already are. Let them talk. The words burst out before Eliza could stop them, before she could swallow them down the way she'd learned to swallow everything else. They've been talking about me for 8 months, calling me diseased, calling me the town's shame, crossing the street so they wouldn't have to walk past me. You think I don't know. You think I didn't hear every whisper, see every flinch, feel every time someone stepped back from me like I was something foul. Lower your voice. No. Eliza stepped forward, her boots sinking into the mud, cold water seeping through the worn leather. You put me in the stockroom so customers wouldn't have to see me. You made me wear gloves to hide my hands. You told me I was scaring people away like it was my fault, like I chose to be sick. Because you were scaring them. Aunt Ida's composure cracked, the merchant's mask slipping to show something uglier underneath. Because every time someone saw your face, they walked out without buying. Because I spent 15 years building that store, and in 8 months you nearly destroyed it just by existing. The words hung in the cold morning air. A bird called from the pines a sharp, meaningless sound. Water dripped from the trees. Mud squelched beneath shifting feet. Something gave way inside Eliza's chest. Not broke, she'd felt things break before. Knew that sharp, clean snap. This was different. This was a wall crumbling, a dam releasing, something held back so long it had become part of her. I didn't ask to get sick. No, but you did ask to come live with me when your parents died. You did ask for food and shelter and a roof over your head. Aunt Ida stepped closer still. Close enough that Eliza could see the veins standing out in her neck, the spit gathering at the corners of her mouth. I took you in when no one else would, fed you, clothed you, gave you work that paid for your keep. And this is how you repay me, running off to live with some stranger in the woods. I came here to heal. You came here to escape, because that's what you've always done, ever since you were 15 years old. Hide in the stockroom when things get hard. Hide behind your apron when customers ask too many questions. Hide from anything difficult. Instead of facing it the way decent people do, Aunt Ida's voice rose to a pitch that made the birds go quiet in the trees. Well, you can't hide anymore. The whole town knows where you've been. The whole town is talking about the Harmon girl who ran off to a mountain man's cabin, like some kind of... Eliza stepped back without thinking, her foot catching on something beneath the mud. A root. A rock. Some piece of the mountain that had no patience for the drama unfolding above it. Her ankle turned, her balance went. Her arms pinwheeled. Grasping at empty air, she went down hard. The impact drove the breath from her lungs. Mud splashed up in a thick wave, cold and brown. Splattering her face, her arms, her chemise. She lay there on her back, staring up at the gray sky. The air knocked out of her, the wet earth soaking through her clothes and pressing against her skin. Mud in her hair, mud on her cheeks, mud filling the creases of her palms when she tried to push herself up and her hands just slid deeper. Aunt Ida looked down at her, made no move to help. Look at you. The contempt was back, sharper than before, honed to a killing edge. Lying in the dirt, like a hog in its wallow. This is what you've become. This is what running away has gotten you. Her voice dropped lower, colder. Is this what your mother would have wanted? Is this what your father raised you to be? A woman who throws herself at the first man who looks at her twice, who wallows in the mud while decent people watch. Eliza's throat closed. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The mud was seeping through to her skin now, cold and gritty against the healing patches on her arms, against the places where the rash had finally started to fade. She could feel it undoing a week of careful treatment, mixing with the salve, grinding into skin that was still fragile. She tried to push herself up again. Her hands slid. Her face went deeper into the muck. Hog in a wallow. That's what she sees. That's what everyone will see when she tells them. The thought pressed down on her harder than the mud, heavier than the cold. This was how the story would be told in town, how Eliza Harmon lay in the dirt while her aunt stood over her, how she couldn't even stand up like a decent person, how she'd become something less than human in her desperation to escape. A hand appeared above her face, weathered, calloused, steady as stone. Up you go. Silas's voice was calm. Mud washes off. Words don't. She took his hand, let him pull her to her feet, her boots slipping in the muck, her whole body trembling with cold and something worse than cold. She stood there dripping, covered head to toe in mountain mud, her healing skin exposed to her aunt's contemptuous gaze. Eliza stays here until she's ready to leave. Silas didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Not before. She's my niece. My responsibility. She's a grown woman, 23 years old. If I counted right. He released Eliza's hand and faced Aunt Ida directly, putting his body between them again. You want to take her by force? Go ahead. Try. Ride back down and get the sheriff. File a complaint. Tell him you're dragging a sick woman away from medical treatment because you're worried about what the neighbors might think. Aunt Ida's jaw worked, her hands clenched at her sides, white-knuckled. This isn't over. No, ma'am, I reckon it isn't. Silas turned to Tom Garrett, who had watched the entire exchange without moving from the doorway. Storm's past. Trail'll be passable if you go careful. Stick to the high ground where the water's drained. You need anything for the ride? Tom shook his head slowly. His eyes moved from Aunt Ida to Eliza, mud-covered, shaking, standing in the wreckage of her dignity, and something flickered across his face. Pity, maybe, or something adjacent to it. I'll ride down with you, Mrs. Harmon. His voice was quiet. Make sure you get back safe. Aunt Ida mounted her horse without another word, gathered the reins in her muddy gloves, looked down from the saddle at Eliza, standing there dripping in the morning light, and her lip curled. When you're ready to stop playing at being a patient and come home to work off what you owe me, you know where to find me. Her voice was flat as a blade. But don't expect me to pretend this didn't happen. Don't expect anyone in town to pretend. She turned the horse. Tom Garrett followed on foot, leading his own mount by the bridle, his bandaged hand held carefully away from the reins. Eliza watched them go until the trees swallowed them. The mud was drying on her skin now, tightening, pulling. She could feel it cracking along her arms, along her neck, along the patches that had been healing so well until she'd fallen face first into the mountain's cold heart. Come inside. Silas's hand touched her elbow. Gentle but firm. Need to get that mud off before it does real damage. Your skin's still fragile, can't have all that grit grinding into it. She let him guide her to the cabin, let him heat water on the stove, let him hand her clean cloths and a fresh bar of the gentle soap he'd made her use all week. She washed alone, behind the closed door of the small room Tom had vacated, scrubbing mud from skin that had finally started to feel like her own again. The water in the basin turned brown. She emptied it through the window, refilled it from the pitcher, scrubbed again. Her aunt's voice echoed in her head, lying in the dirt like a hog. Is this what your mother would have wanted? Her mother had wanted her to be happy. Her mother had held her when she cried about the other children calling her fat, had stroked her hair and told her that size didn't measure worth, that what mattered was the heart inside a person and how they used it. Her mother had sung songs in the dark when Eliza couldn't sleep, had pressed wildflowers in her Bible, had died whispering her daughter's name. Her mother had been dead for 8 years. And in those 8 years, Eliza had learned that maybe her mother was wrong. Maybe size did matter. Maybe appearance mattered. Maybe being the kind of woman other people didn't step back from mattered most of all. She looked at her hands. The mud was gone, scrubbed away. But the shame remained a film on her skin that no amount of water could wash clean. You came here to escape. That's what you've always done. Maybe Aunt Ida was right. Maybe running away was all she knew how to do, run from the stockroom, run from the stairs, run from a town that had decided she was worthless, long before her skin ever started to break. Maybe she'd climbed this mountain not to heal but to hide, to find a place where no one knew her name, where she could pretend she was someone worth helping. But if that was true, if running was all this was, then why did she feel more like herself up here than she had in years? A knock at the door frame. There's tea when you're ready. Silas's voice came through the thin wood, quiet and steady. And something we need to talk about. Something Tom said before he left. Eliza dried her hands, applied fresh salve to the patches the mud had irritated, working it in with gentle circles the way he'd taught her. Took a breath that shook only a little on the way in. What did he say? A pause, the creak of the floorboards as Silas shifted his weight. He said there's talk in town, about you, about me, about what kind of man takes in a young woman and keeps her up on a mountain for a week. Another pause, longer this time. And he said the church ladies are organizing. They're talking about sending a group up here to make sure you're not being held against your will. Eliza's hands went still on the jar of salve. And if you don't go back by week's end, Silas continued, his voice flat and careful. They're talking about getting the sheriff involved. Eliza sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. The afternoon light slanted through the oiled paper windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazy in the still air. The fire crackled low in the stove, barely enough to take the edge off the chill that lingered after the storm. "Tell me," she said. "All of it." Silas sat across from her, his own cup untouched on the worn wood between them. His face was unreadable weathered stone, pale eyes giving nothing away. "Tom said there's been talk building since you left. Folks wondering where you went, why you went, what kind of woman runs off without a proper explanation." He paused, turned his cup in a slow circle. "Your aunt's been feeding it, telling anyone who'll listen that you abandoned your responsibilities, that you ran away from honest work. She would... There's more." His eyes met hers, steady and measuring. "The church ladies, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife they've been organizing, want to send what Tom called a delegation up here. Make sure you're not being held against your will. Make sure nothing improper's happening." Eliza's laugh came out bitter, scraping against her throat. "Against my will? That's rich. They don't know what they don't know. All they see is a young woman who ran off and an old man who let her stay." Silas pushed his cup aside, leaned back in his chair until it creaked. "Tom said if you don't go back by week's end, they're talking about involving Sheriff Dawson, making it official. A formal inquiry into your circumstances." The words settled into her stomach like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, touching everything. The sheriff, a formal inquiry, questions about her virtue, her choices, her reasons for leaving, everything she'd run from, dragged into the light for the whole town to examine and judge. "I should go back." She heard the words come out of her mouth, flat and hollow. "Before they come up here, before they make trouble for you. Is that what you want?" She stared at her hands wrapped around the cold cup. The patches had faded to pale pink, nearly invisible in the gray afternoon light. The itching had stopped days ago. The weeping was a memory. She could look at her own skin without flinching, without shame, for the first time in 8 months. But what did any of that matter if the town decided she was ruined anyway? "What I want doesn't matter." The words tasted like ash. "It never has." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a jay called from the pines sharp, insistent, demanding attention from a world that wasn't listening. "You know what I think?" His voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a blade through cloth. "I think you've spent your whole life doing what other people wanted. Working in that store without wages because your aunt said you owed her. Hiding in the stockroom because customers were uncomfortable. Wearing gloves to cover your hands so folks wouldn't have to see what made them squeamish. Making yourself smaller and smaller and smaller, until there was barely anything left." Eliza's throat tightened, Her eyes burned. I think you climbed up this mountain not just to get away from them, but to find out who you are when nobody's watching, when nobody's telling you to hide. He leaned forward, forearms resting on the table. And I think you've been figuring it out, day by day, jar by jar, meal by meal, finding out what you can do when someone gives you the space to try. What good does that do if the whole town thinks I'm a fallen woman? What good does their thinking do if you spend the rest of your days living by it? She had no answer. The question hung between them, heavier than the dust motes drifting in the slanting light. I won't tell you what to do, Silas said. That ain't my place and never was. But I'll say this plain, you've got a gift for this work, for the organizing, the learning, the caring about things that matter. I've been doing this alone for 15 years, mixing salves, growing herbs, helping folks who climb up here when they've got nowhere else to turn, could use someone to pass it on to, someone who'd keep it going when I'm too old or too dead to do it myself. Eliza looked up. Her eyes met his across the table. You're asking me to stay? I'm saying the choice is yours to make. Stay or go. Face the town, or let them think whatever makes them feel righteous. His voice dropped lower. But whatever you choose it for yourself. Not for your aunt, not for the church ladies, not for anybody but Eliza Harmon. The fire popped in the stove. The tea had gone completely cold. Eliza sat with his words turning over in her mind, trying to find the edges, trying to understand what they meant for the shape of her life. She'd never made a choice for herself. Not really. Every decision she could remember had been shaped by someone else's needs. Her parents' hopes before they died. Her aunt's demands afterward. The town's unspoken rules about what kind of woman she should be. And where had it gotten her hiding in stockrooms? Wearing gloves. Becoming the thing people stepped back from. I need to go down, she said finally. The words surprised her, coming out stronger than she expected. Not because they want me to, not because I'm giving in, because I need to get my things. My mother's quilt, she made it with her own hands, and it's all I have left of her. My father's daguerreotype in its case. My savings that I earned myself, penny by penny, tip by tip. Something shifted in Silas's face. Not quite a smile, he didn't seem like a man who smiled easy, but something close. A softening around the eyes, a loosening of the hard lines around his mouth. And then I'm coming back. She held his gaze without flinching. If you'll have me. If there's still a place here for someone the whole town thinks is ruined. There's a place. He stood, crossed to the shelf where his surgeon's kit sat, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Tom Garrett signed this before he left. I asked him to write it out, and he did it without arguing. He handed her the paper. She unfolded it, squinting at the cramped handwriting in the gray light. I, Thomas J. Garrett, do hereby state that on the 15th day of September, 1886, I received medical treatment at the cabin of Mr. Silas Thorne for injuries to my right hand. Miss Eliza Harmon assisted with said treatment, holding light while Mr. Thorne performed surgical repair of my fingers. Miss Harmon conducted herself with propriety throughout the procedure, and at all times during my stay. I observed nothing improper in the arrangements of the household. Below the words, a signature, Thomas J. Garrett. Why would he do that? Eliza looked up from the paper. He thought I was diseased. He didn't even want to stay under the same roof with me. Because he ain't a bad man. Just scared. Like most folks are when they don't understand something. Silas returned to his chair, lowered himself down with a grunt. You held that lamp for 20 minutes while I put his hand back together. Held it steady. Didn't complain. Didn't look away when the blood came. Hard to go on thinking poorly of someone after they've helped save your fingers. Eliza folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket, next to the note that had brought her up this mountain in the first place. Evidence. Proof. A shield against the whispers she knew were waiting for her in town. "I'll leave at first light," she said. "I'll pack food for the road. There's cornbread left from yesterday, and some of that dried apple." That night, Eliza lay on her pallet by the fire and listened to the mountain sounds settling around her. Owls calling in the darkness, wind moving through the pines with a sound like whispered secrets, the cabin creaking and popping as the cold sank in. Through the wall, Silas's voice murmured low and steady, talking to Mary, to Sarah, keeping his ghosts alive the only way he knew how. She thought about her mother, about the woman who had held her and called her precious when the world said otherwise, about the quilt she'd made by hand, stitch by stitch, the fabric chosen with care from bolts and stores just like Aunt Ida's, about the pressed columbine flower in the Bible, purple faded to gray but still holding its shape after all these years. "I'm going to get it back," she thought. "Your quilt, Father's picture, the money I earned. I'm going to walk into that store and take what's mine, and then I'm going to walk out, and I'm never going back." She slept without dreaming. Morning came gray and cool. Eliza dressed in her cleanest clothes, the calico with the faded roses, washed and mended during her time on the mountain. Her skin was clear now, the patches barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. She applied salve one final time, tucked the jar into her bundle, and stepped out onto the porch. Silas stood by the garden, a walking stick in his hand. Hickory, worn smooth from years of use. He held it out to her. "Take this. Trail's still soft from the storm. You'll want something to lean on." She took it. The wood was warm from his grip, polished to a shine by countless hands before hers. "I'll be back by nightfall," she said. "I know you will." The trail down was easier than she remembered. Her legs were stronger now, her lungs more used to the thin air. She moved through the pines with the walking stick tapping its rhythm against the packed earth, her bundle bouncing light against her hip. The town appeared below by mid-morning rooftops catching the sun, church steeple white against the pale sky, the main street cutting through the center like a scar in the land. Smoke rose from chimneys. Wagons moved along the muddy roads. Life going on like it always did, like nothing had changed. But something had changed. She could feel it in her bones, in the way she held her shoulders, in the way her feet struck the ground with each step. She had changed. Eliza walked onto Main Street with her head up and her eyes forward. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Mrs. Patterson froze with a package in her arms, her mouth falling open. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. Children pointed, and their mothers pulled them close. Whispered words Eliza couldn't hear but could guess at. She didn't slow down, didn't look away. Walked straight to the mercantile, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The bell chimed. Aunt Ida looked up from behind the counter, a ledger open in front of her, a pencil frozen in her hand. "So you've come back?" Her voice was flat, giving nothing away. "Finally decided to stop embarrassing yourself and face your responsibilities?" "I've come for my things." Eliza crossed to the stairs without stopping. "My mother's quilt, my father's picture, my savings." "Your savings?" Aunt Ida's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "You think that money belongs to you, after all the food you ate, the room you occupied, the business you cost me with your condition?" Eliza stopped at the bottom of the stairs, turned slowly. $14.30. 30 cents, she said, her voice steady as the walking stick in her hand. Tips I earned from customers over 3 years. Money I counted and wrapped in my mother's handkerchief and put in my trunk with my own 2 hands. Money that belongs to me. Nothing in this house belongs to you. Nothing ever did. Then I'll take nothing but what my parents left me and what I earned myself? Eliza climbed the stairs. Her aunt's voice followed her, rising in pitch. You walk out that door with so much as a hairpin, I'll have you arrested for theft. I'll tell the sheriff exactly what kind of woman you've become, living up there with that man, doing Lord knows what, while decent people. Eliza reached the top of the stairs, pushed open the door to her room, stopped. The trunk was open, the lid thrown back against the wall, empty. Her mother's quilt was gone. The blue and white wedding ring pattern her grandmother had stitched. The fabric her mother had chosen herself gone. Her father's daguerreotype in its hard leather case gone. The handkerchief with the embroidered flowers. The $14.30 she'd saved over 3 years gone. All of it. Gone. Footsteps on the stairs behind her. Slow. Deliberate. Looking for something, Aunt Ida's voice floated up, sweet as poison. Eliza turned. Her aunt stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, a smile on her face that didn't reach her cold eyes. Where are they? Sold? The quilt fetched $3 at the dry goods store in Denver. Not bad for old patchwork. The picture frame I threw away? Worthless tin. No use to anyone. The smile widened. And the money, well, consider it back rent. Payment for 8 years of food and shelter, and the roof over your ungrateful head. The room tilted. Eliza reached for the door frame, steadying herself against the wood. Her mother's quilt. Her father's face. Everything she had left of them. Everything that proved they'd existed, that they'd loved her, that she'd once had a family of her own. Gone. You had no right. I had every right. You abandoned your position without notice. You ran off to live with a stranger like a common. Aunt Ida caught herself, pressed her lips together. In any court in the territory, that trunk and everything in it would be considered payment for services rendered, wages owed for the work you refused to do. Eliza's hands trembled, not from cold, not from fear, from something hotter. Something that burned in her chest and rose into her throat like bile. She thought about the quilt, the wedding ring pattern, circles interlocking like the lives of all the women who'd stitched them. She thought about the daguerreotype, her father's serious face, her mother's gentle smile, frozen in silver and light. Gone. Sold. Thrown away. Because her aunt had decided she was nothing, had always been nothing, would always be nothing. The heat in her chest cooled, settled, hardened into something else. You sold my mother's quilt, Eliza said quietly. For $3. It was old, worn out. Nobody wanted. It was all I had left of her. Eliza stepped forward. Her aunt stepped back. The only thing that still smelled like her. The only thing I could hold when I missed her so much I couldn't breathe, and you sold it for $3. Aunt Ida's smile faltered. Something flickered in her eyes, not guilt, not quite, but something near it. Discomfort. The recognition that a line had been crossed. That's not. You threw away the daguerreotype, the only picture of my father, the only proof I had that he existed, that he loved me, that I was his daughter. Eliza stepped forward again. Her aunt stepped back again, shoulders hitting the door frame. You took my savings, money I earned, Money I counted in the dark when everyone else was asleep. Money that was mine. You lived here for 8 years. You ate my food. You slept under my roof. I was 15 years old. Eliza's voice cracked on the number, then steadied. 15? My parents were dead 3 days. I had nowhere else to go. And you took me in? Not because you loved me, not because you wanted me, but because you were afraid of what people would say if you turned away your dead sister's child. The words hung between them. Aunt Ida's face had gone pale. That's not true. Isn't it? Eliza looked around the empty room. The bare trunk, the stripped bed, the absence where her life used to be. You spent 8 years making sure I knew I was a burden, making sure I felt grateful for every scrap, making sure I never forgot that I owed you everything and deserved nothing. She turned back to her aunt, looked her square in the face. I don't owe you anything. Not anymore. She walked past her aunt down the stairs, through the store where customers had stopped their shopping to stare at the commotion, out the door. The bell chiming one final time behind her. Main Street stretched before her, muddy from yesterday's rain. People watched from doorways and windows. Whispers followed her like shadows. Eliza walked. She was halfway to the edge of town when a voice called out behind her. Miss Harmon, wait! She turned. Mrs. Patterson stood in the middle of the street, a wrapped package clutched in her hands. Her face was uncertain, her eyes not quite meeting Eliza's. I heard what happened. Just now, in the store. Mrs. Patterson held out the package. The quilt. I bought it this morning from the dry goods store. Recognized the pattern. My mother used to make quilts like that, back in Ohio. I didn't know it was yours until... She swallowed. Until I heard you talking to your aunt just now. Eliza stared at the package. Brown paper, tied with string. The size and shape of a folded quilt. Why? Mrs. Patterson's face twisted. Shame, maybe. Or something trying to become shame. I stepped back from you. That day in the store, when you tried to show me fabric, her voice dropped. I've thought about that every day since. The look on your face when I moved away. I've thought about what kind of person does that. What kind of Christian woman treats a sick girl like she's something unclean? She pushed the package into Eliza's hands. I can't undo what your aunt did. Can't bring back the picture of your father or the money she took. But I can give you this. Her chin lifted slightly. The good Lord puts things in our path for a reason. Maybe this quilt was meant to come back to you. Eliza held the package against her chest. Through the paper, she could feel the soft bulk of fabric, the familiar weight. Thank you, she whispered. Mrs. Patterson nodded once, turned and walked away without looking back. Eliza stood in the muddy street, the quilt pressed against her heart. Then she saw it. A wagon coming up from the south road. A man at the reins, hunched and tired. A girl beside him, thin, pale, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild morning air. The girl's sleeves were pulled down to cover her wrists. But as the wagon passed, Eliza caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. Red patches, angry and weeping, spreading up toward her elbows. Skin that looked exactly the way Eliza's had looked 8 months ago. Eliza raised her hand. The wagon slowed, the driver pulling back on the reins with a tired motion that said he'd been traveling since before dawn. Sir, her voice carried across the muddy street stronger than she expected. Your daughter, how long has she had that rash on her arms? The man's shoulders stiffened beneath his worn coat. His jaw tightened the way people's jaws always tightened when someone mentioned the thing they'd been trying to hide, the thing they'd hoped nobody would notice. What business is that of yours? I had the same condition. Eliza stepped closer to the wagon, the quilt still pressed against her chest. 8 months ago. It started on my wrist, spread everywhere my arms, my neck, my face. Nobody in town could help me. Nobody even wanted to try. The girl leaned forward on the wagon seat, her eyes wide, dark, shadowed with exhaustion, fixed on Eliza's face, on the clear skin, on the absence of the marks she herself carried. You had this. Her voice was barely a whisper. The same thing. The very same. Red patches, weeping. Itching so bad I wanted to tear my own skin off some nights. Eliza met the girl's gaze without flinching. There's a man who lives up the mountain. Silas Thorne, last cabin before the ridge. He's a healer. He treated me, taught me what was wrong, showed me how to make it better. The father's face shifted. Suspicion warred with something else underneath hope. Maybe. Or desperation. The same expression Eliza had worn the day she'd found that note in her apron pocket. The mountain man. His voice was gruff, doubtful. Folks in town say he's touched. Say he talks to ghosts and lives like a hermit. Folks in town say a lot of things. Eliza kept her voice level. They said my skin was contagious. Said I was the town's shame. Said nobody could help me, and I should just accept what I'd become. She paused. They were wrong about all of it. The girl tugged at her father's sleeve. Her thin fingers clutched the worn fabric like a lifeline. Papa, please. He looked down at his daughter, at the angry patches climbing up from beneath her sleeves, at the way she held her arms against her body like she was trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. How do I find this thorn? North Trail, past the old Garrett claim. Follow it to the ridge, you'll see the cabin before you reach the top. Smoke from the chimney, garden out front. Eliza shifted the quilt in her arms. Tell him Eliza Harmon sent you. Tell him I'm on my way back. The man nodded once. A sharp dip of his chin. Snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, wheels squelching in the mud, heading toward the north edge of town where the trail began its climb. The girl looked back as they pulled away. Her pale face caught the morning light. And for a moment, Eliza saw herself the fear, the shame, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might be able to help. Then the wagon rounded the bend and disappeared behind the livery stable. Eliza stood alone in the street. The mud was seeping through the worn soles of her boots, cold against her feet. The quilt was warm against her chest, the familiar weight of it settling something inside her that had been unsettled for 8 long months. She turned north, started walking. The climb felt different this time. Her legs didn't burn the way they had 2 weeks ago. Her lungs didn't seize with every steep stretch. The walking stick tapped its steady rhythm against the trail. And her body moved with it strong, capable, carrying her toward something instead of away from something else. She passed the Garrett claim without slowing, past the creek where she'd drunk on her first climb, the water still running cold and clear over the mossy rocks, past the place where she'd fallen against a pine trunk and heard her aunt's voice telling her she was too heavy, too weak, too much. That voice was quiet now. Maybe it would never be completely silent. Maybe some wounds left scars that ached when the weather changed. But it was quiet. And that was enough. The cabin appeared through the trees in late afternoon. Smoke rose from the chimney. The garden stretched green and silver in the slanting light. And on the porch, two figures waited. Silas stood at the rail, his weathered face unreadable. Beside him, the wagon driver sat on the porch steps, hat in his hands, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The girl was nowhere in sight. Eliza quickened her pace. The fence gate creaked when she pushed through it, and Silas's eyes met hers across the garden. "She's inside?" He answered the question before she could ask it. "Resting. I've examined her, same condition you had. Maybe a bit further along. Started the oatmeal baths already. She's scared, Sharayan, but she's listening a bit." Eliza nodded. Set her bundle on the porch, the quilt still wrapped in its brown paper. "What do you need me to do?" "Right now, nothing. Let her rest. Let the bath do its work. Let her father catch his breath." Silas came down the steps, his boots solid on the worn wood. "Tomorrow's when you start earning your keep." "Earning my keep? You want to stay. You said, want to learn, want to help." His pale eyes held hers, measuring. "Teaching takes time. Time I could be spending on other things. So you'll work for what you learn cooking, cleaning, organizing, helping with patients when they come. Fair exchange." "Fair exchange," Eliza repeated. The words felt solid in her mouth. Real. Like the beginning of something instead of the end. The father rose from the porch steps. His face was still gray with exhaustion, but something in it had eased the desperate tightness around his eyes, the set of his jaw. "I should get back," he said. "Wife's waiting, wondering where we've got to. I'll come back in a week to check on Hannah." Hannah? The girl had a name. A father who loved her enough to drive all night searching for help. A mother waiting at home. "She's in good hands," Eliza heard herself say. "I'll make sure of it." The father looked at her. At her clear skin, her steady gaze, the walking stick she held like she knew how to use it. "I believe you will." He nodded once. To Eliza, then to Silas, climbed into his wagon, and took up the reins. The wheels creaked, the horse snorted, and then he was gone, disappearing down the trail, leaving his daughter in the care of a mountain hermit and a woman the town called ruined. That evening, Eliza helped prepare supper. Venison stew again, she knew the recipe by heart now. Could make it in her sleep if she had to. The smell of it filled the cabin, rich and warm, mixing with the sharp green scent of herbs drying on the rafters. Hannah sat at the table, wrapped in a clean blanket, her damp hair loose around her shoulders. The oatmeal bath had calmed the worst of her itching. Eliza could see it in the way she'd stopped clutching at her arms, stopped hunching her shoulders against her own body. "Miss Harmon," Hannah's voice was soft, tentative. "How long did it take before you started feeling better?" Eliza ladled stew into 3 bowls, carried them to the table, set one in front of Hannah, one in front of Silas, kept the third for herself. A few days before the itching stopped, a week before the patches started fading, she sat down across from the girl. "It's different for everyone. Your body has to figure out what's making it angry, and that takes time. Will it come back? Maybe. Sometimes." Eliza picked up her spoon. "But now you'll know what to do if it does. That's what matters, knowing you can handle it, knowing you're not helpless." Hannah looked down at her stew. Steam rose from the bowl, curling in the lamplight. "People in town were starting to say things about me." Her voice cracked on the words. "Calling me names, saying I was cursed, or diseased, or—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "I know," Eliza reached across the table, her hand covering Hannah's thin fingers. I know exactly what that feels like. And I'm telling you now they're wrong. Every one of them. This isn't a curse. It isn't your fault. It's just something your body does, and we can help it do something different. Hannah looked up. In her eyes, Eliza saw the same fear she'd carried up this mountain 2 weeks ago, the same desperate hope. You really believe that? I know it. Eliza squeezed her hand once, then let go. Eat your supper. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. After the meal, after Hannah had been settled in the small back room that used to be Eliza's, after the bowls were washed and the fire banked for the night, Silas pulled a leather-bound journal from the shelf above his chair. This is yours now. He set it on the table between them. Your patience, your records, what you tried, what worked, what didn't. Eliza ran her fingers over the leather, smooth, worn, waiting to be filled. I don't know enough yet. Nobody knows enough when they start. That's what the learning is for. He lowered himself into his chair, joints popping, and fixed her with those pale, measuring eyes. I'll teach you what I know: the herbs, the preparations, how to read a body's signals, but the rest you'll have to figure out yourself. Every patient is different. Every condition has its own story. How do I know if I'm doing it right? You watch, you listen, you pay attention to what works and what doesn't. He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. And when you make mistakes, because you will, everybody does, you learn from them. Write them down. Don't make the same mistake twice. Eliza opened the journal. The pages were blank, cream-colored, ruled with faint lines. Room for years of notes, observations, discoveries. Why me? The question had been building since she'd first arrived, pressing against her ribs. You could have turned me away that first day, could have sent me back down the mountain like everyone else did. Why did you let me stay? Silas was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled low in the stove. Outside, an owl called from the pines, the same sound she'd heard every night since she arrived. Lonely and wild and somehow comforting. Because you climbed? His voice was rough, but softer than usual. Most folks who hear about the mountain man decide it's too far, too hard, too much trouble. They give up before they start. You didn't. I was desperate. Desperate gets you to the trailhead. It's the climbing that matters, putting one foot in front of the other when everything in you wants to stop. That's something else entirely. He met her eyes across the table. You've got that in you. Eliza Harmon. Always did. Just took you a while to find it. She closed the journal, held it against her chest the way she'd held her mother's quilt on the walk back from town. Thank you, she said, for seeing me when no one else would. He nodded once. A small movement, carrying the weight of everything they'd been through together. Get some sleep. Tomorrow you start learning yarrow. Eliza made her way to the pallet she'd set up near the fire, her new place in the cabin. At least until they figured out better arrangements. She lay down with her mother's quilt pulled to her chin, the leather journal pressed against her side. Through one wall, Silas's voice began its nightly murmur, talking to Mary, to Sarah, keeping his family alive in the only way left to him. Through the other wall, Hannah's breathing had finally steadied into sleep, and outside, the mountain held them all: the healer, the apprentice, the new patient beginning her own journey toward skin that didn't burn and a self she could learn to see without flinching. Eliza closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would learn about yarrow. She would help Hannah with her morning bath. She would write the first entry in her own book of healing: date, patient's name, initial observations, treatment plan, tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. She would become the woman who looked at damaged skin and saw not shame but a problem to be solved, not ugliness, but a body asking for help, not something to step back from, but something to step toward. She would become the woman who didn't step back. The owl called once more, distant and wild. The fire settled to embers. The mountain breathed its slow, patient breath, the same breath it had drawn for 1,000 years and would draw for 1,000 more. Eliza Harmon slept, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she dreamed not of stockrooms and whispers and people pulling away, but of gardens, of jars arranged on shelves, of hands that knew how to heal because they'd learned the cost of not trying, of a life that was finally, truly, her own. If you're still here, sitting with this story, I want you to know something. What we just walked through together carries a weight that doesn't need explaining. That heaviness of being looked at and looked past. That quiet ache of carrying something alone because no one seemed willing to stand close enough to share it. Many of us have known that feeling in our own way. Some of us have been Eliza hiding in back rooms, wearing gloves over wounds we didn't choose. Learning to make ourselves smaller so others wouldn't have to look away. Some of us have been Silas talking to the people we've lost because the silence without them is too much to bear. And perhaps some of us have been Mrs. Patterson, remembering a moment when we stepped back instead of forward, carrying that small weight for years afterward. These things don't need to be fixed or understood completely. They're allowed to sit with us, unfinished. The way old photographs rest in drawers not forgotten, just quiet. It's enough that we stayed with this story to the end. It's enough that we listened. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting these words keep you company for a little while.